What I want to do in this video is take a look at how diseases and sort of the hygiene of small towns compared throughout the medieval period. Okay, so we're going to talk really about the rural areas of England, so the smaller towns rather than the more urban cities. However, we will talk a little bit about the cities as well, because that's where we see the introduction of various kinds of legislation that are brought into the cities to prevent different kinds of hygiene problems. So it's really clear, it should be really clear to everyone that towns in the medieval England were very small. Basically, every single town in this at this time were small, and this, really caused a number of small issues, because the idea of a town being small, not made up of a lot of people, having quite a low economy, sort of meant that it was easier for people there would be less money spent on things that would help with hygiene. Okay. Also, the way the towns were sort of structured and the materials they were made of. Specifically, most houses were packed together and made of wood. Okay. Now, this is partly what causes the Great Fire of London. The Great Fire of London in 1666. Now, this is just a specific example that I can think of where... that's spelled wrong, where the idea of these small wooden houses all compact together became a big problem. Okay, so like I said, the Great Fire of London is a good example of that. However, not exactly in rural area and not exactly in this time period, but still the same problem persisted. And like I said, it would cause fires. They were a common issue in towns, and there was also overcrowding. Okay. And one of the main problems for hygiene and diseases was that towns didn't have clean water supplies. Okay, and there was no way in which there was an effective disposal of waste for these small towns, because they didn't have the money to create these intricate systems to try and clean these areas, to try and make sure that there was clean water and that there was places for waste to go. Therefore, waste was just thrown into the street, and it was left there until it could be washed away. So washed away, either by people with water buckets or mainly with rain. Rain would tend to wash it away. But with these ideas, these weren't things that weren't well known at the time. These were seen as big problems. Okay, and it was in the 1200s that clean water was brought into London specifically via what was known as the Great Conduit. Okay, and this was because people saw that the Thames was becoming too toxic. So Thames was becoming too toxic. Okay, so they needed to find a way to get rid of waste and also bring clean water in, and they used something called the Great Conduit. And in 1388, this problem spread to the rural areas. So you can see in the 1200s, we can see the waste problem affecting places like London. Waste problem in London. And it wasn't until 1388 that the government then prescribed some of these in 1388. Okay, so the government prescribed these in the smaller towns. So the government in 1388 ordered small towns to clean their streets, that their streets should be clean, because they recognised that leaving waste on the streets, so leaving waste on streets was a problem for disease. So it would cause diseases, okay? And now, if we carry on and go a little bit further down, we find that it was just like how it was London. It was started off in London, the sort of waste problems in the 1200s. Then it became something that the government prescribed onto the smaller towns. It then came back to London and York, two big cities in this period of time, when they banned dumping waste in the streets. And London eventually banned waste being dumped into the Thames altogether. So therefore, this was a way of making the Thames a cleaner place and making all of London a cleaner place, okay? And then in York, what were known as toxic businesses were outordered to be practiced outside the city walls in York. And what do we mean by toxic businesses? Well, with things like butchers, tanners, fishmongers, and dyers. Okay, so these are some examples of what you can rely on in the exam of toxic businesses. Okay. Now, with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about monasteries. I mentioned in the last video that monasteries were relatively hygienic, okay? And I want to talk about why they were relatively hygienic, a couple of reasons why they're relatively hygienic, and the different ways in which the disease was less prone in monasteries. So they had cleaner water than towns, and that's because one reason why they had cleaner waters than towns, okay? So they were built near rivers, okay? So monasteries, they were built near rivers, okay? And if there wasn't a river, they would have what were known as man-made waterways. To supply clean water, okay? Now this was a huge deal, okay, because it meant that there was an endless supply of clean water going into these monasteries, okay? And this really comes into play when we look at the bottom point here, that they had small populations, so there was no problem of overcrowding. There was no problem of overcrowding because the populations in monasteries were relatively small, and therefore diseases couldn't spread among so many people. Okay? And they were also relatively wealthy, and the reason why they were relatively wealthy is because money was donated to the church. Money was donated to the church, and there was also taxing in the church as well. So these are a couple of the reasons why the fact that they were wealthy meant that they could build new areas, build new parts of the monastery, but also they were able to put a little bit more effort and focus into the hygiene of their building. Okay. Now, they also practiced a number of different policies, I'd say policies in inverted quotes. So they were able to separate clean and dirty water. So they would separate clean and dirty water. So thus to allow the clean water to stay away from the dirty water so they wouldn't mix and it all become dirty water. And they also had one water supply for cooking and drinking and one for drainage and washing. So we have two different water supplies. So we have cooking and drinking. Okay, and we have one for the drains. So drainage, and we have one for washing. This is also important because it separates the two tasks. The tasks where things go into your body and a task where things leave your body. Therefore, we have a separation of the two, and therefore creating a more hygienic place. These are all basic ideas that are practiced all around the world today without any question. However, at this time, it wasn't even known that dirty water can cause problems, or it was only just becoming a thing that waste and dirty water would in some way contribute to disease throughout the population. So here we just have covered very shortly the different policies that were introduced when we have the introduction of the banning of waste being left in the streets. We also have the banning of what we call toxic businesses in York, in the city walls of York specifically, as a way to separate the brackets toxic businesses out from the less toxic ones. And then we also looked at the different hygiene things that were going on inside monasteries.